Welcome to Lakeshore Focus, a weekly show highlighting challenging issues, fascinating people, and important events in our region. I'm Keith Kirkpatrick. The actions and activities of our local governments touch our lives every day. We need the services they provide more than we realize, yet we relish the opportunity to complain about what they do. Michael Griffin, the Clerk-Treasurer for the Town of Highland, is with us as we look deeply into the major issues in our communities today. Welcome, Michael. I'm glad to have you here.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that generous opening. I hope I'm worthy of that. Thank you.
You always are worthy of it. So
thank you.
You always make it fascinating. So
we'll see how it goes. Okay.
As I said in kind of the beginning, we're going to talk about government politics and just kind of have a little open conversation, because I love to hear your thoughts about that. But maybe right off, why are so many people today so down on government?
That's a great question. I entered government in part as a sense of public service. I had a great graduate school professor that introduced us to a book that talked about some words by Frederick Buckner, where he was defining ministry, and I said it applies to why I'm in public life. And he said it's the place where my deepest joy meets the place of the community's deepest need. In his case, it was the world's need. I'm not that. I'm more modest about my abilities.
But you were going to go into the ministry anyway,
yes,
right?
And so that appealed to me in my sense of being a service, I hope, a leader with a servant's heart. I think the prevailing zeitgeist now has to do with a number of factors, but as we study the so-called Tea Party caucus in the Congress, and they're not just there, they're around the United States, and they talk about their concerns about government. They seem to be a hybrid between what had been typical libertarian views that tend to be very anti-government or very resistant to very much government role in the life of people.
But it's beyond the Tea Party people, it seems like. I mean, it just seems like people in the mainstream of things seem to just be complaining about government, and it's almost everybody's got on that bandwagon of we got way too much government, they're overstepping their bounds. I mean, I hear from almost everyone anymore.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, it's democracy, Keith. It is the view that we can all talk about our government and be experts because every one of us is a boss in a democracy. I think that's fine. I think the job of local officials, anybody who's serving, appointed or elected, is to serve in such a way as to sort of reduce that view and to also educate people about what their government can do. Sometimes the disillusionment and the disappointment, perhaps, if raising to anger, has to do with a non-understanding or a misunderstanding of some of the roles of some governments. I sometimes feel frustrated because I do think that we have compound government at many levels of government that worked very well at one point. I'm not sure now that our models today, for what we need in the 21st century, they hobble us some, I think.
So maybe it's not that government has gotten so big, it's just not functioning the right way we need it to be today. Does that sound like a more accurate statement?
I think that if you were trying to call somebody and you're in the Snyder Town Hall, and that's a modest-sized community of a little between 400 and 600, and if you didn't feel you got your call answered, you'd think that government was too big. So it's the view about feeling that government's not accessible, maybe not accountable, certainly not engaged with you. And maybe that's the fault of the institution and the servants in it, but I think that the ownership of that is also citizens too. We were never supposed to make government autopilot. The whole point about American democracy is that we would all be responsible owners of this large responsibility for governance. So that meant being informed, that meant voting every chance you got, that meant holding your officials accountable and trying to stay engaged. Government has gotten to the point, in some ways it's a success, in some ways it's really a sort of a put down of it, that people could afford to be less engaged. They could go about their lives more and more, and suddenly there's a need for government, or suddenly there's a recognition of where government has had a lapse, and I think it makes people suddenly aware. And since those connections aren't as great as they once were, even at the local level, frankly, which should be the most connected level of government that you associate with.
It's also interesting how we interact with government, because we interact with government in so many different ways, whether it's a police officer or having to go to the county building or getting a bill in the mail from government. There's just, it does seem to be every place. Let me ask you this, because I mean, you're an administrator, you've got a staff. How many staff do you have?
I have a staff of 7.
Okay, so you have 7 people. I happen to be in, I'll keep it nameless, where I was the other day, but it wasn't your office, okay?
Thank you.
That I was in one of our government offices, And I see people in blue jeans. I see people just not dressed very well. They're talking about their family life for I don't know how long. I'm just watching this. They've lost my file. They can't find things. And I'm looking at this and going, do they know what this looks like from the citizen's point of view who's standing on the outside watching this? What is that disconnect that they don't realize how that's coming across?
If you were in the private sector, Keith, as somebody who's been successful in the private sector yourself, you wouldn't really hold those workers accountable as you'd hold their supervisory or the higher levels of responsibility accountable for that, would you not?
That's probably true.
So to me, I think that's equally true in this case, although ultimately the voters are responsible, but the officials that they send to work there have to cultivate the right kind of environment that's supposed to be a hybrid, in my opinion, of the best we see in the private sector in terms of service, that's customer service, but it should be more. Because if I treat a resident as a mere customer, that's transactional and contractual. It should be transcendent over that. Because that resident is also a citizen who is one of my bosses, arguably. So I want every one of my workers in my office to not only be professional in their dedication to their work, but remember that that's the boss coming in. And so to be engaged with them in such a way that the service seems polite, that people have empathy, even if you're delivering bad news, never communicate that you're joyful over it. Nobody should take any joy over that. Those are the kinds of things that you would see in the best, I think, practices in the private sector, and those are absolutely translatable into the public sector. Save that one example, as I said, where I think that if you're a mere customer, then that's not really recognizing the depth and the nuance of the relationship.
You know, I've heard you talk about that so many times before, about citizens are your boss,
yes.
You know, because you're an elected official. But is that the same feeling an employee has that works for government? I mean, do they really say, oh, you're my boss? In fact, I almost think it's the opposite. Don't be my boss.
I'm sure that that's the opinion you get. I think many of my workers do, although they realize that I'm the boss, but they realize that I wanted them to share in my service. I always thank them for helping me serve our boss, the public, better, help me in that service, and they serve too. When I worked for Congressman Visclosky, I always say that he's one of the two best bosses I had, the people of Highland and Congressman Visclosky. I always believed he was the accountable one as the elected official. In the end, the decision had to be his. But when he would invite me to represent him in other places, I felt I was serving the public as well. But I felt the added onus of representing the official that had hired me. So I felt that I was both serving in my own way, but also very cognizant of I was serving on his behalf. And so my conduct had to be fitting for what he would expect. And he still does, he has very high standards of service that he imposed on himself.
But the way you feel and you think about this, do you really feel that there's that many other government officials that feel that same way?
I do. I don't know, Providence has smiled on me because I've been recognized. I talk about it, and I probably, as my grandma Griffin used to say, talk pretty about it. But there's a number of people who may not articulate it the way I do, or have been maybe not be as reflective about it.
You do think about this a lot.
I to the point of being, I'm in full bloom nerd about it. But I think there's many people who every day believe that it's a privilege to be asked to serve the public, that they want to know their job and they want to know it better every day. They're not just satisfied with saying what they were told was going to be the job, they want to know it better. Particularly in the number of administrative jobs that get elected in Indiana. We still have a very holdover for Jacksonian democracy where we elect a lot of stuff here. A lot of folks in positions, and that can be good or bad. Nevertheless, we do, and so a lot of times you have non-policymakers who just have to, be able to be fit administrators, fit deliverers of service, try to get efficiencies for all of these kinds of things that government has to do, such as tax collection, fiscal management, management of corners and meets and bounds if you're a surveyor, those kinds of things. So I do think that there's a lot of people who want to do it well. I do think we sometimes send people who are willing to serve, which is one of the qualifications in a democracy, who may not be as equipped to serve as they could be. But that's an open question in a democracy.
Which is a whole other issue. But I do appreciate that you continue to preach, going back to your ministry calling, this need, the importance of being a servant to the citizens. But let's focus a little bit on some of the people who maybe still don't get that concept, because I do believe there's a lot of people out there who do get it. Congress, the United States Congress, has one of the lowest approval ratings of any institution. In fact, if you look at some of the surveys, I think back in June there was this big survey that said that they were the lowest ranking institution in the country. 10% approval rate. Huge disconnect between American citizens and the confidence they place in our U.S. Congress. What is going on there? I mean, is the system just broken?
Well, there's a lot of levels to your question. That's pretty probative and insightful. That could be a show, practically, I think. I'm going to give you my...
We can make it part of this.
I've thought about it a lot, actually, as I think about these things to an nth degree. My view is that a lot of the disenchantment with the Congress right now has more to do with the economy. The disconnect between what appears to be a recovery from a recession that still seems jobless. And I think that people expect the Congress to make that job one. And as we know, it's not been. Some of that's not their fault. The international theater acts. So Syria does something and we need to respond. And then there's all these other kinds of things because, as a former pastor friend of mine used to say, life is so daily. On the other hand, there is also the belief that even if they were paying attention to that, what has happened where it's become acceptable to not legislate as a strategy? Or you could announce without any real social stigma, I'm going to make my job to never agree with the president who proposes, as opposed to, I'm going to make my job to express my disagreement policy-wise where it's appropriate. But in the end, I think my job is to try to do the best I can for the people who sent me, and then in a larger context for my nation. That may mean legislating. And so when you hear the kind of talk...
But you don't hear that kind of thing from people at that level of the U.S. Congress much.
Well, maybe we're not hearing it. I'm sure,
Okay.
I think our congressman here says it, but we don't know a lot of what's going on in the town halls, because the ones they cover are the ones that are more tempestuous, where you have a lot of people who are sort of exercised
Much
over
better
a particular...
TV.
Yeah, it is better TV. I have to say, I'm taken with it as well. And it's an interesting thing that's going on. I do think, though, that there's a lot of challenges that the institution of the Congress is going to have to grapple with because of what they've been confronted with. I think, I know this is going to make me not a lot of friends in public life who share my partisanship necessarily, or on both sides. I think that we have to get serious now about how we apportion the Congress. The law basically gives that to the states. It's traditionally been what the General Assemblies or the state legislatures get to do. I'm more and more convinced now, because of computers and because it becomes a gamesmanship deal where you try to make it as good as possible for the team you're on. So if you're a Federalist or a Whig, you're going to try to do the best you can for them, as well as the current parties. I'm more and more convinced that that now has played itself out to what many people warned could happen. You now have a Congress, a House especially now, the Senate's a little different because the state is the district, a House where, absent some extraordinary overreaching event, it is likely that the majority party now will remain that for as much as 10 years. And not that that's so bad per se, because we had histories in this country where you had majority party dominance for a time. But there is an element within that majority party that got elected for purposes that have been unusually seen in the modern Congress, that believes that they came to not behave, they came not to go along, that they think that they're supposed to combust things. And there may be a view that that's valid, but it's also made the way Congress has traditionally worked not work so well.
So are you saying the system keeps those people locked into office at this moment?
Nothing's ever permanent, but they have a higher likelihood of victory. I mean, you even hear people who are moderates in either party worried about getting a challenge from either their left or their far right if they don't sort of toe a particular prevailing line.
Wouldn't it be interesting if a computer model could be made that every 4 years or 2 years that the districts would just kind of really reconfigure themselves, which would really
and
force
do what they're
people
supposed
to
to do, which is about communities of interest that are compact and contiguous. That's what the law says. But here's another idea. Whatever the parliamentary authority uses, whether it's Robert's Rules, Jefferson's Manual, which is basically what the Congress uses, the idea is that majorities should still rule with respect for numerical minority rights. What we have in the Congress...
Where does it say that?
That's the principle that's embodied in Roberts. You have to read his book called Parliamentary Law first before you read his rule book to know that.
Again, the nerd thing, right?
The nerd thing,
Okay.
I'm proud that I could say that to all my parliamentary friends. That's the underlying idea, and to have the orderly disposition of business. What's happened in the Congress now is you have actually a numerical minority within the majority who can now alter outcomes significantly. So you, in effect, have majority rule not happening. Now, it's partly the design of the Congress. It's 2 houses, bicameral. You want things to be deliberative. You don't want law to be easy. but we never made it so that it could be obstructed entirely. That was never the intention, I believe.
Do you feel it's that way now? It's
Yes.
obstructed entirely?
Yes.
And how do we fix that then?
Well, I'm open to very good suggestions. One of the things I suggested is I think that we have to re-examine the way in which we configure the apportionment in the House. We have to take that out of the hands of the partisan legislatures and somehow get a nominating group that who may or may not be partisan, but will be largely citizen appointed of some kind. Somehow it's got to be taken out, where they'll have more incentive to try to draw the lines, less about protecting a particular partisan advantage and more about that looks like communities of interest that meet all the constitutional requirements.
How do we ever get to something like that when you've really already got a very biased group in control?
Well,
how would they ever let go of?
This I will tell you, the Indiana General Assembly actually passed a law that was going to create a commission for that, and the General Assembly did it. They just didn't make it apply in the current instance, so we'd have 10 years of whatever the legislature would decide upon.
It
and
happens
the other one
at some point in the future, is that
Yes.
what you're saying?
Yes, it
So,
goes in the future.
So I mean, sometimes it almost feels like this whole thing is kind of hopeless, and I know you're still a very hopeful person, but again, how does the average citizen who's pretty frustrated with this, what are they supposed to be doing? Other than complaining?
Well, this is one of the particular vexations of this system now. In the House side, one of the things that pundits smarter than me have noticed is that the way the districts are drawn, there's not a lot of repercussion for the national view. They've been drawn so effectively for the objective to protect an incumbent of a particular party, and they're dominated now by that number of people I've described as the Tea Party caucus. And I'm not critical of it, it just is. That the pressure that they're getting from their public is to induce them to be more of what they're doing in many cases and not more conciliatory. In fact, right now, that's not considered a very publicly acceptable quality.
So it feels like the system is broken, I guess, as we look at it. So something needs to be done. And I know you're a person who proposes doing something dramatic from time to time. You've talked about, let's shift locally just for a few minutes, because we still seem to struggle here with not being able to kind of consolidate or work together more closely in our whole region. Are we in the same dilemma kind of as a national picture?
No, I don't believe we are. I do believe that our institutions, I've always said that the ultimate reform for government is who you elect. Because regardless of structure, there's some structures that lend themselves to being more effective and some that tend to be hindrances, but it wouldn't matter the structure nearly as much of your local government if you have really good people elected. So that's one. And that sometimes is achievable by getting good people to run, and sometimes that's selecting wisely from the very good people who do run.
How do we get better people to run?
Well, that's a tougher question.
Because I think a lot of people are afraid to run because it's like they look at the abuse, the
I've been lucky I don't get that, but you do. You have to be prepared not only for the criticism if you win, but for the fact that you're out there willing to sort of say, I want to do these kinds of things, and you may not have the favor of a majority of your neighbors. And it doesn't really mean you're a bad person or that they dislike you per se. It just may mean that they prefer the other person or they just don't feel the way you do about those issues. And no matter what kind of preparation you have for that, Keith, having run statewide and coming second in a two-person race, you still take it personally a little bit. It's just impossible. And I think in a way that's good, because if you could be that hardened to it, you probably ought to get out of public life, because you'll lose your sensitivity to the people you're serving. You need to be engaged that way. But I think that shouldn't stop people. I do think that people think that the hours more and more are more difficult, the problems seem more intractable. I would even go as far as to say, and this won't make me popular in some respects, I suspect, we probably ought to evaluate the pay of public officials, not so much for the policy people, the elected councils, and maybe even, but I do think that some of the administrative offices, certainly the mayors of the major cities, that may be evaluated to see if it would attract someone, or maybe do something where you have a pay structure based on a particular set of skill sets. So they'll be paid this basically, and if they're really talented, great. Or maybe you have it with a certain educational attainment or a particular skill set or certification. Maybe that gets a little bit more.
We might need qualifications, you're saying, for some of these jobs?
Well, I'll just say this. Whether or not they should be more or less...
That'd be unique, wouldn't it?
Well, whether or not it should be more or less, you just be the judge. The qualifications for the office that I hold presently is that I had to be 18 years of age and I had to be a registered voter.
And that's
it.
pretty much it.
And I am essentially the chief financial officer for essentially an organization that does in excess of $20 to $25 million of revenues annually.
That's pretty incredible. You and I could talk about this stuff probably forever, and we're down to the last minute. If there was a message you could give to kind of the citizens out there to help improve what we're doing, what would that message be?
Be hopeful, get engaged. If you're not registered to vote, vote, and make your feelings known. Anytime that there's going to be a mayor's night out, or there's going to be an open meeting of some kind, go. If you can't attend, make sure you pressure your officials to make that go on television. You can go online now and watch your legislature. If you can't get to Indianapolis, it's just a click away to watch what they're up to. I shouldn't say it in that fashion, to see the work that they're doing.
Okay. Well, let me add to that, make your feeling known. Let's hope there's a little substance to people also sharing what they feel about something. So
I agree.
We'll have to have you back for another time so we can expand this out a little further.
Yeah, we didn't talk about the income tax. There's a whole body of things. We didn't talk about some of the environmental challenges for contracts with sanitary districts.
So that'll be next time.
I hope so.
All right. Thanks for being here, Michael. Okay. Bye-bye. So easy to complain about government. In fact, it has become a national pastime. Just eavesdrop on nearly any conversation and it will eventually arrive at the bashing of our incompetent, overreaching, excessive, tax-hungry government. Our first mistake is that we throw everyone associated with government into one category and say they are all bad. Government has many dimensions, and the simplest to define is level: federal, state, and local. We also need to note that there are those who are elected, others appointed, and many who are employees. Do the math. 3 levels times 3 divisions, and you have 9 groupings. If you blend political affiliation into the equation, the number increases. How can we possibly throw everyone into one category and condemn all of them? If we stop doing this, we will begin to notice that there are people in all of the groups and at all levels who are doing a good job, some even excellent. Now that we are assessing specific individuals, let's take a look at our accusations. Unethical, ignorant, and self-serving are broad descriptions. What did that person specifically do that warranted our label? Did he or she really cross that line and move into an area we describe as poor behavior and performance? Or is that individual just daring to see an issue differently than we do? As participants in this experiment we call democracy, where do we fit in and what is our responsibility? Are we fully informed on the issues or problems at hand? Have we attended any meetings, read any materials, or talked to anyone? Have we listened to the thoughts of the person we are questioning, or even shared our analysis, not just our opinion? If we cannot say yes to any of these questions, maybe we should change what we are doing. There will always be some people in government who are incompetent, unethical, even criminal. They need to be held accountable. In the meantime, let's stop complaining about all of them and try a different approach. Thanks for watching. We'd really like to hear your thoughts about today's show. Did you agree or disagree with the ideas you heard? Email your comments to focus@lakeshorepublicmedia.org or reach us through our website, which is listed on your screen. Join us next week for another Lakeshore Focus. I'm Keith Kirkpatrick saying, make a positive difference in our world today.